Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're diving into First Solar's Q4 2024 earnings call.
Yeah, this is a really interesting one.
It is. There's a lot going on. Record sales, new factories, even a little international intrigue.
Yeah, it's a great snapshot of where the solar industry is right now. I think a mix of explosive growth, but some pretty significant headwinds too.
Definitely a lot to unpack here.
Yeah,
So let's start with the headline numbers. First Solar just blew past sales expectations, right?
absolutely. They pulled in $4.2 billion in net sales for 2024,
Wow.
which is a 27% jump from the previous year.
That's huge.
Yeah, it's pretty clear. Demand for solar is through the roof,
Yeah.
and First Solar is riding that wave.
So everybody's copping champagne, sunshine, and profits all around.
Well, not so fast. While sales were stellar, their earnings per share, or EPS, actually came in lower than analysts were predicting.
Okay, so that's the record sales, but lower than expected earnings puzzle we got to solve here. That's the story there.
So there are a couple of factors at play. First, they got hit with some unexpected costs, mainly warranty charges related to their earlier Series 7 modules.
Ouch, yeah. I remember those production issues they mentioned last quarter. Those are coming back to bite them a little bit now.
Yeah, a little bit. It's definitely impacting their profitability.
So those warranty charges eating into their profits. Anything else impacting the bottom line?
They also made a strategic decision to sell off a chunk of their 2024 tax credits.
Okay, so help me understand that. Why would they sell off those tax credits?
Well, it's a bit complicated, but essentially by selling those credits, now they're getting cash up front that they can reinvest in the business.
Okay.
It might make their earnings look a little lower today, but it could fuel even bigger profits down the road.
So it's kind of a trade-off. Short-term earnings hit for potential long-term gains. Interesting strategy.
Exactly. And it speaks to the fact that First Solar is playing a long game here. You know, they're not just focused on next quarter's numbers, they're thinking years ahead.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got this tension between booming sales and managing these unexpected costs. What else is going on with First Solar?
Well, one of their big focuses right now is U.S. manufacturing. They're in the midst of opening up new plants in Alabama and Louisiana with a goal of hitting a massive 25 gigawatts of production capacity by 2026.
Wow. 25 gigawatts.
Yeah, that's a serious commitment to American-made solar.
So what's driving that?
Well, it's partly a response to all the talk about supply chain vulnerabilities, wanting to reduce reliance on overseas manufacturing. But it's also about seizing a huge opportunity. With all the government incentives and policies aimed at boosting domestic clean energy production, the U.S. market is about to explode.
Right, the Inflation Reduction Act and all those clean energy initiatives.
Exactly.
But here's where it gets really interesting. This is all happening against a backdrop of intense policy uncertainty. With the recent elections, no one's quite sure what's going to happen with tariffs, trade deals, even the future of the IRA itself. Yeah, that sounds like a real nail-biter for a company like First Solar.
Yeah.
How are they handling that uncertainty?
It's definitely making things tricky. This uncertainty is making some customers hesitate to sign long-term deals.
Really?
Yeah, they're kind of in wait-and-see mode, which makes it harder for First Solar to fully capitalize on that booming demand we talked about.
So they're caught between this incredible market opportunity and this cloud of policy uncertainty. What a dilemma.
Yeah, tough spot.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about what's happening internationally. Things are a little more complicated there, too, right?
Definitely. First Solar has had to scale back some of its production in Malaysia and Vietnam.
Why is that?
It's a combination of factors. Part of it is that global policy uncertainty we talked about, but they're also facing increasing competition from Chinese solar manufacturers.
Right. They've really become a dominant force in the global market, haven't they?
Absolutely.
So it's like a global chess match with First Solar trying to make strategic moves amidst all these shifting pieces.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
It makes you wonder, how does a company even plan in this kind of environment?
It's a balancing act for sure. And to make things even more interesting, First Solar isn't afraid to throw some punches when it comes to protecting their technology.
Ooh, right. They just filed that patent infringement lawsuit against Jinko Solar.
That's right. It's all about Tito-Pecan technology, which is a key innovation in solar panel efficiency.
Right.
First Solar is sending a clear message. They're serious about defending their intellectual property.
But they also recently struck a licensing deal with a U.S. manufacturer, Talon PV.
Right.
So it's not just about lawsuits. They're also open to collaborating.
Exactly. It's a multi-pronged approach to protecting their innovation. They're willing to fight where they need to fight and partner where it makes sense.
So they're playing both offense and defense when it comes to their IP. That's fascinating.
Yeah. And just to add another layer of complexity to this whole mix,
Yeah.
there's this global scramble for resources happening right now. China just slapped export controls on tellurium.
Tellurium. Refresh my memory on that one. What is it and why is it such a big deal?
So tellurium is a crucial material used in First Solar's thin film solar modules. It's relatively rare, and China's move to restrict its export has kind of sent shockwaves through the solar industry.
So we're talking geopolitics, trade wars, and the hunt for key materials, all impacting First Solar's business. This is getting intense.
It is. It really highlights how interconnected the global economy is. Everything from government policies to material scarcity can impact a company like First Solar.
Okay, so amidst all this chaos, what's First Solar's outlook for 2025? Are they still optimistic?
They are cautiously acting. They're projecting sales between $5.3 billion and $5.8 billion for 2025. And for earnings per share, even with all these challenges, they're estimating between $17 and $20. Not bad at all, considering all the curveballs they're facing.
So they're forecasting continued growth, but acknowledging the uncertainties ahead. Makes sense.
Exactly. It's a delicate balance between optimism and realism, which is probably the smartest approach in this environment.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Record sales, but pressure on earnings manufacturing expansion, but policy uncertainty, international challenges, and IP battles, and now a global resource squeeze.
Yeah.
It's a lot to take in.
A lot to digest. Yeah.
But it's a great overview of what's going on with First Solar.
Absolutely. And it gives us, I think, a really interesting glimpse into where the solar industry is headed.
So where is the solar industry headed? What are the key takeaways from all this?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? What's clear is that First Solar is in a strong position. They're a leader in the U.S. market. They've got a massive backlog of orders, and they're making these strategic moves to try to stay ahead of the game. But there are definitely some risks to watch.
Okay, so let's unpack those risks.
Right.
What are the big things investors should be paying attention to?
Well, that policy uncertainty is a big one. If tariffs are imposed or the IRA gets significantly altered, that could have a major impact on their bottom line.
And what about the competition? Those Chinese manufacturers seem like a real threat.
Absolutely. They're relentless and constantly innovating. First Solar needs to keep pushing the boundaries of technology to stay ahead of the curve.
And what about those supply chain issues? How big of a risk is that tellurium shortage?
That's a big wild card. If they can't secure the resources they need, it could disrupt their production plans and really hurt their growth. And let's not forget about those lingering warranty charges.
Right. Those are still looming, and it's unclear what the final impact will be.
Exactly. So there are definitely some question marks hanging over First Solar's future.
Okay, so bottom line, after this initial look, are you bullish or bearish on First Solar?
That's a tough one to answer definitively. I think there's a lot to like about their position, but also some legitimate concerns. It really depends on your individual risk tolerance and how you think those external factors are going to play out. One thing's for sure, though, it's a company to keep a close eye on in the coming months.
I definitely agree on that. Okay, and now for the moment you've all been waiting for. This is not financial advice, but what if we wanted to play this earnings call a little differently?
Oh, I like where you're going with this. Let's get a little speculative.
First Solar is heavily exposed to the U.S. market, right? So what if we hedged that bet by shorting a Chinese solar company that's reliant on exports? Just a thought experiment, of course.
I like it. What's fascinating about that is it creates a kind of paired trade where you profit if the U.S. market booms and First Solar takes off, or if China's solar industry stumbles. You're kind of playing both sides of the fence there.
Exactly. We're talking pure speculation here, folks. Definitely not investment advice. But it's the kind of outside-the-box thinking that makes following the market so interesting.
Absolutely. It's all about understanding the bigger picture and finding creative ways to manage risk. Now, the question is, which Chinese solar company should we pick for this hypothetical short?
That's a tough one. There's so many to choose from. What about...
Hold on. We don't want to spoil all the fun just yet.
All right, you got me. Tune in next time for the thrilling conclusion of our first solar deep dive, where we'll reveal our target and explore this wild world of paired trades. See you then.
Welcome back to our deep dive into First Solar.
Last time we left off with a bit of a cliffhanger. You were just about to reveal which Chinese solar company we'd hypothetically short in this paired trade scenario.
Yes, the moment of truth has arrived.
So spill the beans. Which company are we targeting?
Okay. Based purely on speculation and absolutely not financial advice, I'd say JA Solar.
JA Solar. Okay.
Ah.
Intrigued. Why JA Solar specifically?
Well, what's interesting about JA Solar is their heavy dependence on exports.
Okay.
Particularly to Europe.
Right.
And if those trade tensions we talked about escalate,
right,
they could find themselves in a real tight spot.
But Europe's market is already flooded with cheap Chinese solar panels. Wouldn't more tariffs just make things worse for them?
Exactly. And they're also facing increasing competition from other Chinese manufacturers, even within their own domestic market. They're kind of getting squeezed on both sides.
So they're vulnerable to trade wars, intense domestic competition. Anything else we should be considering?
Well, remember those export controls on tellurium that China just imposed?
If those restrictions expand to include materials that JA Solar relies on, that could further disrupt their production and really hit their bottom line.
Wow. So we're talking about a potential triple whammy for JA Solar. Trade wars, domestic competition, and resource scarcity?
Yeah.
It's starting to sound like a pretty compelling short, at least hypothetically.
Again, this is all just a thought experiment, not a recommendation.
Yeah.
But I think it does illustrate how understanding the broader geopolitical and industry trends can help you identify interesting, albeit risky, trading opportunities.
It's like playing chess, where you're not just thinking about your core move,
right,
but also anticipating your opponent's moves and the moves after that.
Exactly. You have to think several steps ahead to really succeed in the markets. Now, circling back to First Solar for a moment,
okay,
they're also grappling with a tricky issue when it comes to their production costs. They've got this gap between their cost per watt produced and the cost per watt sold, and it's cutting into their profitability. Right? I remember that from their earnings report.
Right.
Why is their cost per watt sold so much higher than what it costs them to actually manufacture the panels?
So it boils down to what are called period costs. These are all the expenses involved in running their business beyond just the manufacturing process itself. Think things like shipping, warehousing, and all the costs associated with getting those new factories up and running.
Okay, so these period costs are adding a significant chunk of expenses on top of their raw manufacturing costs. And a big part of that seems to be those warehousing issues they've been having, right?
That's a major factor.
Yeah.
They're essentially drowning in inventory right now, partly because of those project delays we discussed earlier. They're also having to juggle production across different regions, which adds to the logistical complexity.
It sounds like a logistical nightmare. So all this warehousing is eating into their margins. Is that something investors should be worried about long term?
Well, the good news is much of this seems to be temporary or transitory, as they say in financial jargon. Once those project delays ease up and they optimize their global production network, those warehousing costs should come down.
Okay, that's reassuring. But what about those other period costs, the shipping and the ramp-up expenses for the new factories? Are those likely to stick around?
Well, their sales freight costs seem relatively stable because they've locked in long-term contracts with shipping companies. That was a smart move on their part.
Yeah, good planning there.
Yeah.
But those ramp-up and underutilization charges, those are tougher to predict, right?
Exactly. Those depend on how quickly they can get those new factories in Alabama and Louisiana up and running at full capacity.
So it's a race against time to get those factories online and start churning out panels.
In a way, yes. And let's not forget those lingering warranty charges from the Series 7 module issues. Those are still a wild card that could continue to weigh on their earnings for a while.
Right. The ghost of Series 7 modules passed. Okay, so we've got this complex web of costs and risks that First Solar's trying to manage, but they're also investing heavily in research and development, which is a good sign.
Absolutely. They're not just sitting back and reacting to events. They're actively trying to shape the future of solar technology.
I like that proactive approach.
Yeah.
Tell me more. What kind of R&D are they focused on?
Well, they're continuing to improve their core cadmium telluride technology, which is what their current panels are based on. But they're also exploring next-generation thin film materials like perovskites.
Perovskites. That sounds pretty futuristic. What's so special about them?
So perovskites have the potential to be even more efficient and cost-effective than traditional silicon solar cells. If they can crack the code and bring perovskite technology to market at scale, it could be a real game changer for the entire industry.
So they're betting on both the present and the future of solar. That's smart.
It is. They're hedging their bets, which is a wise move in such a rapidly evolving industry. It's like they're playing a long game while still trying to win in the short term.
I like that analogy. It really captures the challenges and opportunities they're facing.
Yeah.
So what's your take on their R&D efforts? Are you optimistic?
I'm cautiously optimistic. I think they've got a strong track record of innovation, and they're clearly committed to staying at the forefront of the industry.
But as you said, with something as cutting edge as perovskites, there's no guarantee of success.
Yeah.
It's a high-risk, high-reward kind of endeavor.
Exactly. Research and development is inherently risky. But first, solar's willingness to invest in the future, I think, is a positive sign. It shows they're not afraid to take calculated risks to maintain their competitive edge.
It signals that they're thinking long-term, which is crucial in an industry as dynamic and innovative as solar.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now let's shift our focus to the policy landscape, which, as we've discussed, is a major factor for any solar company, but especially for First Solar, given their focus on the U.S. market.
Right. They're heavily reliant on government policies and incentives to drive demand and support their growth. What's the latest on that front? Any good news?
Well, remember that trade case against those Southeast Asian solar manufacturers that we touched on earlier? The one that First Solar was instrumental in bringing forward. There have been some recent developments on that front.
Right. The one where they allege that some companies are circumventing tariffs by routing their production through Southeast Asia.
Exactly. Well, the Department of Commerce has already slapped some preliminary tariffs on those companies, and we're expecting a final ruling in the coming months.
So if the final ruling goes in First Solar's favor, wouldn't that level the playing field and give them a significant advantage in the U.S. market?
Potentially, yes. But it's important to remember that tariffs are a double-edged sword.
Right.
They can help protect domestic manufacturers like First Solar, but they can also drive up the cost of solar panels for consumers. And if solar becomes too expensive, it could slow down the adoption of clean energy, which wouldn't be good for anyone in the long run.
So it's a delicate balancing act. Policymakers are trying to protect American jobs and manufacturing, but they also don't want to stifle the growth of the solar industry as a whole.
Precisely. It's a complex issue with no easy answers, and it's something investors need to keep a close eye on. The future of the solar industry in the U.S. depends heavily on the policy decisions being made in Washington right now.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Record sales, unexpected costs, manufacturing expansions, international challenges, legal battles, resource scarcity, research and development, and the ever-present policy uncertainty. Whew! It's a lot to process.
It's a lot to digest, but I think it paints a fascinating picture of where First Solar stands today and where they might be headed in the future.
So before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, let's take a moment to recap the key takeaways for our listeners. What are the 3 most important things they should remember from this conversation?
That's a great question. Okay, here's what I would say. First Solar's operating in a complex and rapidly changing landscape. They're facing challenges on multiple fronts. Booming demand that they're struggling to fully capitalize on, political uncertainty, global competition, supply chain disruptions. It's a wild ride.
It's like they're navigating a minefield while simultaneously trying to build a rocket ship.
That's a great analogy. Second, they're not just reacting to these challenges. They're making proactive strategic moves to adapt and position themselves for continued success. Investing heavily in U.S. manufacturing, defending their intellectual property, exploring next-generation technologies like perovskites. They're not just sitting on their laurels.
They're playing offense and defense simultaneously.
Yeah.
I like their aggressive yet strategic approach.
And third, their future success really hinges on several key factors. Can they resolve those warranty issues? What happens with those trade cases? Will the policy landscape stabilize? And perhaps most importantly, can they execute on their ambitious growth plans? There are a lot of moving pieces, and it'll be fascinating to see how it all plays out.
It's a high-stakes game with a lot of potential pitfalls, but also the potential for huge rewards. Okay, we've set the stage, explored the complexities, and identified the key factors to watch. Now it's time for the grand finale, where we turn all this information into actionable insights for investors.
I'm ready when you are.
All right, stay tuned for part 3, where we'll connect the dots and explore what this first solar deep dive really means for your portfolio. Welcome back, everyone. It's time for the grand finale of our first solar deep dive,
where we distill all this information into actionable insights. It's been a wild ride, but I think we've got a pretty good handle now on what's driving First Solar's business and what the future might hold.
Exactly. So let's cut to the chase. The big question on everyone's mind is First Solar a buy, a sell, or a hold right now?
The million-dollar question. If only it were that easy to answer. As we've seen, First Solar's story is full of complexities and contradictions. There are strong arguments to be made on both sides.
It's like one of those gourmet meals with a ton of different ingredients, some sweet, some spicy, some savory, and the final flavor depends on how it all comes together.
That's a great analogy. And just like with a complex dish, there's no single right answer. It all comes down to individual taste, or in this case, an individual investor's risk tolerance and investment goals.
So instead of giving a simplistic buy, sell, or hold recommendation, let's break it down into key considerations for potential investors. What are the factors they should be weighing?
That's a great approach. Let's start with the positives. First, solar has several things working in their favor. Sky-high demand for solar energy, a leading position in the U.S. market, a massive backlog of orders, and a clear commitment to innovation. They're not standing still. They're constantly pushing the boundaries.
They're firing on all cylinders, at least from a growth perspective. And with the world transitioning to cleaner energy, they seem incredibly well positioned to ride that wave.
Absolutely. But as we've discussed, there are also some potential red flags that investors need to consider. Those lingering warranty charges are still a concern. The ongoing trade disputes could go either way. There's a lot of uncertainty surrounding government policies, and we can't forget about the rising cost of raw materials. Plus, the competition from those Chinese manufacturers is fierce.
Right, they're facing headwinds from multiple directions. So it's a classic risk-reward scenario. Big potential upside, but also a decent amount of risk.
Yeah.
How should investors be thinking about balancing those factors?
Here are a few key questions to ask yourself. First, how comfortable are you with risk? First, solar is not for the faint of heart. If you're looking for a safe and steady investment, this might not be the right fit. But if you can stomach some volatility, the potential rewards could be substantial.
Right. It's not a set it and forget it kind of stock. It requires a bit more attention and a willingness to ride out the ups and downs.
Exactly. Second, what's your investment horizon? Are you thinking short-term or long-term? If you're a long-term investor, you might be more willing to overlook those short-term challenges and focus on the company's long-term growth potential. But if you're looking for quick profits, this might not be the play for you.
So it's important to align your investment strategy with your time horizon. Don't go chasing short-term gains on a stock that's built for the long haul.
Absolutely. Third, how do you see those external factors we talked about playing out? What's your take on the trade wars? What do you think will happen with government policies? And what's your outlook for the solar industry as a whole?
These are big picture questions, but they're crucial for understanding the context in which First Solar operates.
Right. You can't just look at the company in isolation. You have to understand the forces shaping the entire industry. And finally, and this is a crucial one, what's your assessment of First Solar's management team? Do you trust them to navigate these challenges effectively and make smart decisions that will benefit the company and its shareholders in the long run?
Because at the end of the day, it all comes down to execution. The best strategy in the world won't matter if the team can't deliver.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So it's not about finding the right answer when it comes to First Solar. It's about asking the right questions, doing your own research, and then making an informed decision that aligns with your own individual circumstances and risk tolerance.
It's about taking ownership of your investment decisions, not just blindly following someone else's recommendations.
Exactly. Now, before we wrap things up, let's revisit that paired trade idea we were playing around with earlier. Remember, we were talking about potentially shorting J Solar as a way to hedge our bet on First Solar.
Right, a way to potentially profit if either the U.S. market booms or the Chinese solar industry stumbles.
Yeah.
Purely hypothetical, of course.
Of course. Just a fun thought experiment to illustrate how investors can think outside the box and find creative ways to manage risk. But with that said, it's important to acknowledge that shorting stocks is inherently risky. It's not a strategy for beginners.
Yeah, you can potentially lose a lot more money than you put in when you short a stock.
Yeah.
It's definitely not for the faint of heart.
Exactly. So if you're considering a trade like this, you need to have a strong conviction in your thesis. You need to believe, based on your research, that J Solar stock is likely to go down. And you need to be prepared for the possibility of a short squeeze where the stock price suddenly surges and you're forced to cover your position at a loss.
All right, short squeezes can be brutal. It's like playing with fire. Okay, so strong conviction awareness of the risks, anything else investors should be thinking about.
Yes, you need to have a clear exit strategy. Decide in advance when you'll close out your position, both if the trade goes in your favor and if it goes against you. Don't let emotions drive your decisions. Have a plan and stick to it.
So even with a speculative trade like this, it all comes back to discipline and risk management.
Always. Okay, so to sum it all up, first, solar is a fascinating company operating in a dynamic and rapidly evolving industry. There's a lot to like about their position, but also some risks to consider. Whether or not to invest is ultimately up to each individual investor to decide based on their own research, risk tolerance, and investment goals. And as always, this is not financial advice. Do your own due diligence and make informed decisions that align with your personal circumstances.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into First Solar. It's been an enlightening journey.
It has. Until next time, happy investing, everyone.